Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie Mehta. I'm the CEO of a media company called Mansueto Ventures. We publish Fast Company and Inc. magazines, and I'm delighted to be leading, or as I prefer to say, being traffic cop for this panel on crises, experimentation, and innovation. Before I introduce our awesome panelists, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. As a reminder, if you do want to tweet about this panel or anything about the World Economic Forum annual meeting, please make sure to use the hashtag WEF22. And this is a great room because it will facilitate a lot of interaction. So we're going to have a conversation up here for about 25, 30 minutes, and then we really want to bring you into the conversation. But if you have a question or a burning comment that you want to raise while we're talking, just raise your hand, and we want to start bringing the audience into the conversation as early as possible. So to cover this topic, as I said, we have this amazing panel. Immediately to my left is Seth Berkley, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. Everybody here should know Gavi pretty well, but it's a public-private global health partnership with the goal of accessing immunization in poor countries. Next, we have Frank Giels, who is a professor of systems innovation at the University of Manchester in the UK. Donnell Baird is Chief Executive Officer of Block Power USA, which is a climate tech company which is seeking to decarbonize cities and city buildings. And Julie Girdman is Chief Executive Officer of Everstream Analytics, which uses AI and analytics to help businesses build sustainable and autonomous supply chains. So welcome, everyone. So the topic at hand is innovation and experimentation in time of crises. And one of the things that I want to explore is what constitutes revolutionary innovation versus evolutionary innovation, and also what are the things that we can do to inspire innovation for all, not just innovation for the very top of the pyramid. And I wanted to start by asking Seth to talk a little bit about what most people in this room would probably identify as a revolutionary innovation in time of crisis, which would be the vaccines that emerged amid this COVID-19 crisis. Would you consider that revolutionary innovation?
Absolutely. So thanks, and it's good to see all of you. I just want to introduce and then jump into the answer to that. So important to say, Gavi was started here 22 years ago at the WEF, and the idea there was, how do we move out of rigid systems, bring the private sector, bring everybody in to solve this big problem. And it's been very successful. And it obviously isn't just vaccines. It's delivery, it's data systems, it's how to break down barriers, it's the gender issues. So that's what we did. And when 2.5 years ago, which I like to say was 25 years ago in dog years, when we were here last, we were beginning to hear about this Wuhan thing. And we sat, another institution that was started here, CEPI and I sat together and said, is this the big one, or is this the dress rehearsal for the big one? Regardless, we've got to move ahead, and that's when we began to form COVAX. Now, at the time, there were, the previous record in a vaccine was 4 years. And we said, obviously, that's not good enough. If you had asked me, would it be 327 days? I would have said, no way that we could get there. And now we're aiming for 100 days. So that is radical and acceleration. But here's an example. You all know the mRNA vaccines. That's what you'll think about as the innovation that occurred. But the truth is that those are very fast vaccines. We don't know yet if those are the best vaccines in terms of duration of protection. And so now there's a bunch of, we have 12 vaccines in our portfolio, but there are a couple of dozen that are out there. And what we need to do now is to understand, which one has the best niche, which combination of them work best, and then, of course, how to get them to the whole world, which is what we're working on.
Everyone here probably knows some of the backstory of how those vaccines came to be. But from your point of view, Seth, what were the conditions that enabled the speed of the innovation?
Well, I mean, first of all, 20 years of investment ahead of time in these technologies. I went to Moderna 5 years before this, because here was a new technology that might have applicability for diseases that people weren't paying attention to, tropical diseases and others that didn't have big commercial markets, and they were working on a bunch of those. And what happened is, of course, it could be accelerated. But we had the same experience, it's amazing, in Ebola in 2015, and we had a lot of discussion here about that. At that moment, there were already vaccines frozen away. And the reason is George Bush, after the anthrax, concern, he was worried about bioterrorism. They had this on the list, so people created vaccines for it. And then they said, well, it's not a great bioterrorism, organism, and there's no market for it because it's a few poor people in rural areas in Africa. And so at the end, it wasn't developed. And we were able to dust that off and then get the trial done. And now there's a stockpile that's there, and we're using it. We had 3 Ebola outbreaks during COVID. And people don't focus on that, but able to deal with it. So it's that combination of being able to break through in those circumstances, but also figuring out how to create those markets for products for diseases that are rare, now Ebola is relatively rare, but there's a lot of other diseases on that list of WHO, and we need to figure out how to work in peacetime to make those vaccines.
So this is an innovation and a revolution that was 20 years in the making. Frank, you study the time frames, among other things, for innovation. Is it wrong for us to be thinking about revolutionary innovation, given that something like the vaccines that Seth was just talking about really did require a lead up?
Yeah, no, I studied transition, so these large-scale system changes. And you need radical innovations for those. But it's useful to distinguish the invention, the innovation, and the diffusion. So the invention are the first ideas, the research and development, which of course happened with the vaccines. The innovation is the first introduction into markets. And then the diffusion, that often takes 20, 30, 40 years for it to actually have the revolutionary effects. So if we think about solar and wind, the first research started after the first oil shock, 1973, which was a shock where there were no alternatives available. So there was we were still dependent on big oil shock. Then we started to do research, massive research, also on nuclear, but also on solar and wind. This was in the 70s. Only now in the 2010s have they started to diffuse. This is 30, 40 years later. Now, this is not uncommon. I've studied transitions from horse and carriage to automobiles, from sailing ships to steamships. It takes 30 to 40 years for these large-scale transitions to happen. So the revolutionary innovations are important, but to actually have the revolutionary effects to change the system is not just the invention or the idea, but actually to roll it out. I mean, the vaccines are in some way easier, not scientifically, but you don't need to change the whole material infrastructure of society. I'm interested in climate change or low-carbon transitions. There you actually need to change whole infrastructures, the whole material supply chain. There's huge vested interest resisting this. So it's a different kind of challenge. So I do think we need to distinguish different kinds of crises. And it depends also the timing of the crisis versus whether or not something is available. So if we have a crisis and there's no alternative available, which I think happened with COVID, but also with the oil shock, then you need R&D and then you need upscaling and all the rolling out. But when it happens at a time when there are alternatives available, often in small niches, then it can actually be a lot quicker. So there are already entrepreneurs, the innovations have already developed for 5 or 10 years. Then we get a shock, which creates a window of opportunity. And if there's then political will and market demand, it can be rolled out much quicker. So if in that case, the crisis can really accelerate the rollout and the transformative effects.
Can I just add one point to that, which is, on the vaccine access issue, the world right now is 59 to 60%. Lower and lower middle income countries, 50% of the population is now at 46% with 2 doses. Is that good or is that bad? Now, obviously, we want equity, but one of the issues is normally it takes a really long time, and it was unbelievably accelerated to your point, and the crisis allowed that to happen, but it's still not good enough. So how do you take it to that in an emergency, be able to take it equitably up?
Yeah. Building on some of what Frank said, Danelle, as part of the work you're doing for Block Power, you're essentially going on a charm offensive from city to city, trying to get the politicians and the communities to buy into what you're trying to do with decarbonization. Maybe just to set the stage, tell everybody a little bit about what Block Power is practically doing to decarbonize cities, and then a little bit about the way that you have to bring resistors along.
I really wish I was charming, but thank you.
It would make the charm offensive easier, right?
It would certainly make it easier to implement that. I mean, I think we think about two simultaneous crises. We have a crisis of unemployment and gun violence, which are correlated in America, and we had a horrible shooting yesterday in an elementary school. And then a week ago, African Americans were gunned down in a grocery store by an unemployed dude. So you have this unemployment and gun violence crisis in America, and then simultaneously you have the climate crisis. And how can we think about using both of these crises to create something different? Low-income buildings in America overconsume fossil fuels, so the biggest, wealthiest buildings that have like indoor swimming pools consume a lot of energy. And urban buildings that haven't been invested in for 30, 40 years because there's no technical assistance or resources consume a ton of energy per square foot. And so when you walk around a low-income community, of which there's millions and millions of people who live in low-income communities in America, you see that there's at least two kinds of waste going on. One is the waste of fossil fuels that are being overconsumed in all the buildings because they're so neglected. The other is the waste of the human potential of the people that live in these communities who are underemployed, which correlates with higher rates of violence. And so the way we think about it at Block Power, our tech startup, is we want to turn these low-income buildings into Teslas. Just like Tesla has taken the fossil fuel engine out of automobiles, we now have the hardware out of Japan to take fossil fuel heating equipment, air conditioning equipment, cooking equipment out of buildings and make existing buildings 100% electric. And because we can make existing buildings 100% electric, that electricity can come from wind, from hydro, from solar, and so you can really start to decarbonize millions and millions of buildings at scale. And because there is a shortage of skilled construction workers to implement these projects, if you can get to scale, then you can start to solve the unemployment and gun violence crisis. So there's two projects that we're working on. And I'm thrilled that my very first investor, Cheryl Dorsey, is here, and she has been working on Block Power with me for 10 years. She was the only person to believe in our company. Even my wife didn't believe in the company at that time. Cheryl was first. Is this being recorded? Is my wife gonna?
You're live.
I'm sleep deprived, honey. I haven't been sleeping. Jet lag. So.
Hashtag WEF.
Great. So we have a project to decarbonize the first city in the world, Ithaca, New York, where Cornell University is located, has 6,000 existing buildings. We're going to go building to building and move every building off of fossil fuels, and every 25th building, we're going to put in an electric vehicle charging station. We're going to put heat pumps and rooftop solar and do all of that. But we're also hiring 1,500 people from low-income communities that the NYPD and the state of New York and the Attorney General have indicated are at risk of participating in gun violence. And so by hiring these low-income people from these communities and training them in electrical and green construction and augmented reality construction, we're trying to reduce unemployment and gun violence and trying to address the climate crisis at scale at the same time. So that's what we're doing.
So just to follow up on that, what you've just laid out seems pretty unimpeachable. Are there resistors?
Hell yes. There's the gas industry, as represented through local construction firms who they've trained. So you have 50, 60 years of people who've only been trained to install gas furnaces. We were talking about this. It's the same in the UK. It's the same in Europe. You have generations of tradespeople who our blue-collar workforce, they only know how to install gas. And so if you call them and say, hey, I want to go all electric, they don't know how to do it, and they're going to try to upsell you on sticking with fossil fuels. So you have that, and they vote. So that's one stakeholder base. And then you have the energy utilities that have spent billions of dollars laying gas pipelines to pipe gas across states and countries to people's homes. And so they have a lot of CapEx invested in gas infrastructure and oil infrastructure. And so these are very powerful stakeholders who are incredibly resistant to everything that we're doing.
And what about the consumers or the community groups?
Well, one of the things we try to figure out is how do we talk to community groups around how this is in their self-interest. And they do care about the climate crisis, but they have other, shorter-term objectives. They care about gun violence. They care about jobs. They care, like all of us, about the health of our kids. There's a Stanford study that came out last month that shows that all of us who cook with gas in our homes, the gas ovens leak methane, even when they're not on. Like when we're sleeping at night with our kids, like we're all breathing in methane that's being released from the gas ovens in our home, much less when we're cooking. The stoves release nitrogen dioxide, which is highly correlated with spiking rates of chronic childhood asthma. And so when you look at the relationship between the utilization of gas ovens in your kitchen or gas to heat your home or provide hot water for your morning shower, there's a correlation with like increasing rates of chronic childhood asthma because kids get asthma because we're cooking, we're burning dead dinosaurs in our home and breathing it in, right? It's crazy. So we talk to communities around, hey, we're gonna make your home healthier. We're gonna remove the mold, the lead, the asbestos. And by the way, while we're doing it, we're gonna lower your energy bills and we're gonna shift you from fossil fuels to electricity. So we talk to people about their short-term, healthcare, energy bill, employment needs, and other kinds of interests that they have, and try to tie that back to the broader crisis of climate change.
Julia, a lot of the conversation here at the World Economic Forum annual meeting has, in one form or another, come back to supply chain issues and supply chain crises. Your technology helps automate and provide analytics to companies that are trying to address their supply chain issues. What is it like? Are you in the eye of the storm right now? And has this crisis actually accelerated innovation at your organization?
Yes, I believe it has. So at Everstream Analytics, we look at everything through the lens of risk. And there's risk end-to-end in supply chain, whether it's the raw materials, components that go into goods, through procurement, business continuity, all the way to the last mile logistics. And this risk, it's always been there. But over the last few years, we've really seen heightened awareness, heightened volatility, and the variety of risk really, really accelerate. And so it has. It's accelerated innovation. It's accelerated the implementation of technology. And really what it's done is created a visibility and transparency. As I was listening to the panelists, I'm thinking about what's really required is more visibility, more transparency across everything that we're talking about. And technology can provide that. So in our case, it's big data, right? The more data, the better. And leveraging artificial intelligence on top of that data, as well as human intelligence. That's what can provide the visibility that's needed, and needed in a way that's more predictive versus reactive, right? So it's one thing to react, and I think we've learned the lessons over the past few years of just reacting, versus that having predictive capability, knowing in advance, and having these actionable insights to make decisions. The other underlying thing I think I'm hearing from the discussion is that it requires a level of trust, and that's hard, right? Like trust is core to everything that we're talking about, but data and technology can enable trust, right? And you think about even some of the newer innovations in technology, such as blockchain, which provides a level of trust. Many sessions actually here this week have been on the metaverse. And in supply chain, actually, we've been using something very similar called a digital twin, where customers will actually digitally map their supply chain and be able to see along their supply chain, how we all know it's very interconnected, right? And it's quite fragile. But to be able to visualize this in a digital way, ultimately in a metaverse type of augmented reality way, that truly will accelerate into the future how we think about supply chain and what we can do about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, Donald.
I just want to wave in quickly. I couldn't agree more. To build on what you're saying with some specific example, one of the things we're doing is the Bezos Earth Fund is Jeff Bezos gave us a grant to build digital twins of 100 million buildings across America so that we could start to model and understand how they were using and wasting fossil fuels now, and to build a predictive model of how we could, on a building by building basis, figure out how to decarbonize every building in America, right? And so the AI, if it's used properly, not to do surveillance on black people like me and send me to jail because a camera saw my face or whatever, but if AI is used properly, and if blockchain is used properly, because I lost so much fucking money in crypto last week, it can be incredible innovations that help us respond to these crises. Yeah,
there has to be shared value. I think one of the things that people might overlook is there actually have to be shared incentives, shared value, where all the constituents gain. And we think about this, so we work with the World Economic Forum on the Global Supply System Dashboard. So we provide data and visibility in supply chain because humanitarian supply chains are inextricably linked to corporate supply chains. It's really one and the same global supply chain. And there's a need for safety, there's a need for access, there's a need for visibility and that prescriptive information to make decisions, whether it's for vaccines, whether it's for technology, whether it's for the decarbonization. And the other thing that we do is look into tiers of supply chain. So who is your supplier? Is there a risk? Are they located in Ukraine or Shanghai, where things are, might be struggling or locked down? So having, again, visibility deep into the supply chain will then help prevent and accelerate things.
Frank and then Seth.
Yeah, I was just trying to connect your point about supply chain risk to Donald's point about solar and wind and renewables. Because of course, what we've learned from the crisis in Ukraine is if you're dependent on supply of oil and on one main supplier, should we then swap that for a reliance primarily on China, which is the main supplier of batteries, solar panels? As we know, they may, who knows, something may happen in Taiwan. They may, disrupt that supply chain. So, is there a risk, if you talk about risk of supply chains, if we are swapping towards renewables, that we change one supply dependence of oil and gas towards another, which would be, electric, the batteries, the solar panels, the cobalt from Congo, the rare earth metals. I mean, the supply chains go everywhere. So whatever, in every transition, we create new kind of risks. And of course, we want to go to renewables and move away from fossil fuels. But are we not at risk creating new dependencies, which may, create new vulnerabilities in the next 5 years?
Go ahead.
I'm just so, it's interesting because, I agree completely with what you said. The challenge I have, and just to be absolutely honest, it's amazing. I can go to my, supermarket and find a banana, and you can go back and trace what tree that banana was on. We're delivering billions of doses of vaccines. And at that last mile in places, people are saying, we got all these great tools and IoT and everything else. No, zero. So you don't know where they are, you don't know what conditions they're stored in. Now, we're chipping away at that, but one of the issues is how you make it cost-effective and user-friendly down at that last mile. And an example, we tried to get, we now have done it because we mandated it, but there were no barcodings on vaccines. And the issue was, well, developing countries don't have barcode readers and they don't have databases, so why would we barcode? And then, of course, the other side of it, why would you create databases and, readers and everything else if you don't have barcodes? So we kind of ultimately mandated it, and it will now hopefully have an effect. But, I'd love as we think about these solutions, how we make them available to the village level in a place that doesn't have electricity, doesn't have internet. And I know you have to ultimately connect it back, but we've done that in other ways, so there are ways to do that. But that will make a transformational change.
Agreed. I think there's an opportunity for public-private partnership there, very much so. And I think that things like IoT, so in the life sciences industries that we serve, we really have fragile product, right? And protecting that through the last mile is critical. So you're right. There's an opportunity for IoT devices to actually travel with them that there is that capability, and it has to be instituted then actually at the final mile in underserved communities completely.
Which is not happening is the point.
Well, we want underserved communities to own the new infrastructure that gets put in to solve this last mile connectivity problem. So during the pandemic, Cheryl again bailed me out with a grant to, we got a call from some of our customers in the Bronx who didn't have internet. And they were like, hey, Danelle, we know you install internet because we have to stream data from our solar panels and heat pumps that we put into buildings, and in low-income buildings, there's no internet. So we put in a rooftop antenna. So they said, all the kids are home, there's no internet. They can't learn remotely. Can you put in some internet, not for your solar panels, who cares? We got COVID going on. We need to work and learn remotely. And so the question is, as we solve that last mile broadband problem, who owns that new infrastructure asset? And so echoing Green and the Biden-Harris administration gives a little bit of money to install a community internet system that serves a couple of 100,000 low-income families in the Bronx. And we thought they should own it. So as we have these crises, that we should create holding companies where low-income families get actual equity stock, not just equity in terms of like what's fair and what's just because we're liberals, and like equity, like I think about equity stock in the infrastructure asset that's being installed to solve the last mile problems that you're talking about here. And then we can start to look at addressing the wealth inequality crisis that is affecting all of our politics.
I want to go to questions or comments from the audience in just a second, but before we do, I know there are entrepreneurs and founders in the audience or who are watching on the live stream, and I wanted to ask, maybe I'll start with Julie and then go to Frank, about, and Frank, you referenced this a little bit earlier, there is a little bit of a tension between radical invention and trying to plug into existing systems. Because if you want to affect change at scale, in some cases, you do have to plug into that existing system. On the other hand, you don't want the existing system to then drain your enterprise of what makes it radical, of what makes it sort of entrepreneurial and maybe even just a little impertinent. So Julie, maybe you could talk first about how your organization is mindful of what's already installed.
Yes, at Everstream, we like to say that supply chain is a team sport, and that really teams win when they work together. So everything's been designed, both the team and the way we've built the team, but also the technology to be interoperable, to be able to integrate with core systems that organizations already have in place. So we absolutely believe in an ecosystem, right? And the ecosystem is stronger as the technology can talk to one another. It's useless for any organization, public, private, to have standalone technology, because then it's an investment, it's kind of lost funds, because you're wasting money. You're putting systems in place and then not getting the benefit. So ultimately, to drive the outcome, we believe in alliances and then having really an open API system that connects.
Frank, what does your research tell you?
Yeah, there's a whole research trend in evolutionary economics, which talks about waves of destruction. This goes back to Schumpeter, and they portray these transitions as sort of David versus Goliath. So the new entrepreneurs, the new entrants versus the incumbent players, and they portray it as a struggle. And of course, there are many examples where the big players then die because they don't adjust quick enough. That's a nice story, but there's many examples, of course, where the big players actually fight back. And as Donald was saying, we are talking about the biggest companies on the planet. The oil companies, the gas companies, the utilities, these are still in the Fortune 500 in the top. So you can either decide to portray it as a struggle, or if you maybe as an entrepreneur are more, one clever tactic would be to actually have an alliance, as you just said, to collaborate with them rather than see it as a struggle between new and old. Can we maybe collaborate with the old and do something new together? So that might be a more clever way to get change going, even though there's a price to pay usually. When you've got a radical idea and you start to work with the people that are already there, they may not be so keen to change. So they want you to dumb down or to get some of the radical edge out of it. But that's the price to pay for success, because you may have more quicker access, but the transformative effects initially may not be as high. But then over time, of course, you hope to sort of have further knock-on effects. So there's different ways in which you can think about radical change. Either it's a struggle where you, as the David, try to overthrow the Goliath, and you may win, but it may take a long time. Or you can work with them and try to sort of, in that way, bring about change.
Danelle, could you ever see yourself working with the Goliaths?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I want to destroy them. And I think that I mean, at our company, we study Uber, right? I mean, we study Airbnb, who, hyper disruptive companies that came into an existing transportation or tourism industry and were super disruptive and then raised enough capital quickly enough to become a player and have the resources to no longer be a David, but to be at least a mini Goliath or something similar. And I don't apologize for that on behalf of climate and the low-income people that we want to employ and represent. So we think that is important. We also do, where we can, think it's in our best interest to cut deals with oil and gas utilities. And I'll just give you a quick 30-second example. National Grid, which is a UK gas company, they're very progressive in the UK. They're not very progressive in New York State, where they control 40% of the energy system in the state. But what we've done is we're saying, the regulators won't allow you guys to own electric vehicle charging stations. Let's go to them together and make an argument. No one else is going to finance electric vehicle charging stations in low-income communities. So let the gas utility wet their beak, as they say. Let's give them an ownership slice of electric vehicle infrastructure in low-income communities in New York State, so that they have a financial incentive to build out the green infrastructure of the future. So yeah, you partner where you can, and in other instances you fight. But I think for up-and-coming entrepreneurs, you want to keep a level head and figure out what's best for your firm and your customers and your stakeholders, and try to stay cool and calm even when you fight.
Questions for the panelists or comments? Yes, could you stand up and just tell us your name, please, before you ask your question?
Hi, I'm Sue Valeriot. I had a question for Dr. Berkley. Did you find with the vaccines coming at such a rapid pace this time that we had some already existing information from SARS-1? Was that 9-10 years ago or something? And in that case, it was able to help you quickly establish it, as well as mRNA. Well, there's mRNA everywhere. I mean, within us, and so that was a quicker thing to do. And when you were talking about barcodes, I read this bizarre thing in Africa. I think it was in Egypt. A man had 12. He took 12 doses over 4 months. He was a 70-year-old man, because he said it made him feel much better. So he kept getting vaccinated, because the village had no way of knowing that he was continually getting vaccinated. So in that case, even if you go the extra mile, it's like the guy's already had 20 doses or something, and he's perfectly fine, apparently. Anyway, just wondered about the previous vaccination.
So, it's not just the original SARS. There was also MERS, which is another coronavirus. And so there was work on both of those pathogens. But it's interesting. What happened is MERS got into a debate. Do you vaccinate the camels? Do you vaccinate the people? And so people kind of leaned towards camels. With SARS, as you know, it disappeared. And so there was a lot of work on vaccines, and then they just stopped. But the knowledge was there. The work on the antigens was there. And that's one of the reasons they could move so quickly. But, one of the things that happened, I thought you were going to ask a slightly different question, which is, was there a problem with getting these vaccines moving so quickly? People worry about safety and all of that. And what was so interesting, this is radical change in a time of crisis, is the general way you review these didn't change. What happened is you did everything in parallel. You did adaptive clinical trials instead of doing a phase 1 and then stopping and analyzing it for a year and then a phase 2. And so what you did is you got the same information and didn't compromise on safety, but you squeezed it down. And now, as we're talking about 100 days, the question is looking at each step and what is possible to get rid of without, we obviously don't want to put unsafe vaccines into healthy people. So you don't want to compromise on that safety, but how do we do that?
Other questions from the audience? Comments? Seth, let me ask you a little bit about how we maintain the energy that we have during crisis when there are so many competing forces for people's attention. I moderated the Preventing the Next Pandemic panel yesterday, and Bill Gates came out with an op-ed right around the time the panel started saying that, we can't take the gas off of pandemic preparedness and prevention because we're also thinking about Ukraine. We're also thinking about supply chain. Any thoughts on how we allow ourselves to prioritize multiple things at once?
Well, first of all, what's really interesting, so when we had the Ebola crisis, we had, panic, and that gets attention. And then you go into neglect. And if I give an example, even here at the WEF, that year it was like #1 on the risk register was epidemic diseases. The next year it wasn't on the risk register at all. And I was trying to raise money for the stockpile, and people were like, Ebola, that's yesterday's problem, even though it could happen again. Now, what we need is in peacetime investments, and the way to do that is to change the dialogue about pandemics. I mean, people kind of weren't interested, and, yes, it's upsetting me and this, but then you neglect it. If this becomes a security issue, I mean, we spend gazillions of dollars practicing wartime games in peacetime. We have, multiple layers of systems to protect against nuclear attack and everything, even though it's not incredibly likely, although I suppose right now I shouldn't say that. But the point is that there is a system in place, and it's tested all the time. We don't have that in pandemics. So here at the WEF, 3 or 4 years ago, we had a pandemic simulation exercise and tried to get people across all sectors to think about it, and people lost interest. So I don't know, maybe that's human nature, but hopefully we can place it in a different place in the hierarchy.
Frank, you wanted to add on?
Yeah, this issue of competing issues is a normal problem in transitions because, after the shock you get invention. It takes a long time, and, the world is currently so complex, usually other things happen. So what we are now seeing is this can disrupt the initial problem. So with the climate, of course, there was a lot of momentum, with the net zero pledges in the last couple of years. And now, of course, the opponents of this transition, the low carbon transition, see an opportunity with the rising energy prices to say, we can't afford this, we shouldn't do it, it's too expensive, we've got other priorities. This happened after the great financial crisis as well, of course, 2008-9 completely disrupted all the green investments. So they're trying to slow this down, understandably. But the right tactic is, as Donald said, in the literature, this is called issue linkage. So you need to try to change your framing, what you wanted to do anyway, the rolling out of this low-carbon transition. You need to develop a narrative which combines the different issues together. So you linked it to unemployment, gun violence, and now, of course, that's how you have multiple issues give you a reason to do it. And of course, with the gas and oil prices now, we see some countries indeed slowing down. The UK indeed is using this to drill for more oil and gas. But you see the European Commission, Frans Timmermans yesterday, they're doubling down on the European Green Deal. They say exactly, they now link it to security, and if anything works, link it to the military, no, seriously. And that's really now giving them extra momentum. But you see other countries, so these crises create a window of opportunity, and it plays out, the politics plays out differently in different countries. Luckily, there are some leaders, in this case Frans Timmermans in the European Commission, who've used this crisis to actually double down and to accelerate the transition away, even though they know we probably need a little bit more coal for the next 1 or 2 years to deal with this gap. We need to be practical as well, but they're actually doubling down on rolling it out. So that's the right strategy, to try to cleverly link multiple issues together, to continue with your narrative, to roll it out. But we need to be aware there are opponents waking up with a counter narrative, and they say, no, we can't afford this, we've got other priorities now, cost of living crisis, people don't want this. So it's ongoing, I think, this struggle.
Julie.
Yeah, I think, but crisis, there are like long-term crises that are occurring right in front of our eyes, right? And I think that in terms of the climate, for example, so what we look at, and again, there's co-innovation opportunities here. We look at water. Think about water and water risk. We're not, it's one that corporations actually care about. So we co-innovate over decades. Where do I build my manufacturing facility? I need water. Industrial processes, all of them need that. 30 years from now, will there be water in a certain location, right? There may not be. So these decisions, yes, there's a short-term reaction, but you've got to take into account the longer term. And these are examples where I think we can work together to really use that proactive visibility and predictive capability.
Questions? Yes. Could you wait for the mic, just because of the live stream, and let us know who you are?
Hey, yeah, I'm Paul Commuti. I'm with Train Technologies. And actually, I came because we have solutions, actually, that manage temperature both in the cold chain to the last mile and electrification of buildings. So these are great topics. And Frank, I really appreciated the model of invention, innovation, and diffusion. And it seems to me that diffusion is the big topic for both the cold chain and electrification of buildings. The pandemic has seemed to accelerate the diffusion of the technology. And I'm wondering, you know, what are like the key issues that we could address to accelerate the diffusion of the technologies in these two cases?
Want to take a stab?
I've heard the issue of rolling out and diffusion many times through this conference. I think there's the broad awareness that we need innovation, but actually to solve issues or to bring about a revolution, it's about diffusion. I think what you need varies a little bit maybe for vaccines, you know, where you need skilled medicines and also refrigerators to deploy it for the low carbon crisis. For low carbon, we need a lot of money, finance, you know, it's going to cost in the trillions if we take this serious across all the sectors. What are we going to do with the big companies? You know, we can portray them as the enemies, and sometimes they are fighting back, but some are also reorienting. You know, the car companies are reorienting, some of the utilities are reorienting. And the last thing I would say is also, how do we bring the public along? Social acceptance, you know, this is a big issue, there are equity issues. This was a concern that Frans Timmermans said as well. How do we get this accepted? How do we get also consumers interested in doing things? I think it's great if you do it at a block level, because then, what you said, you can explain to them why this is important. But if you leave it to consumers on their own, they may think it's just a hassle, you know, for 3 months to have someone install a heat pump. The heat pump is more spacious, it's maybe more costly. In many instances, if you leave it to the consumers without helping them in some way, it's not going to happen. So I think finance, what do we do with the big players, and how do we get the public along? You know, you need a big narrative. The same, I think, with the vaccines. There are so many people who believe this counter-narrative. There was a conspiracy of the state, and 20 to 30% of the population has not done the vaccines. So we've lost a large part of the population in explaining them, but this is actually beneficial to them directly, which I think is very telling for these kind of times. So how do we bring this, you know, segment of the population along?
Believe it or not, the cold chain, prior to COVID, we had replaced 65,000 cold chain units in the poorest countries, and we put in, you know, new technology, nanotechnology, solar, and the reason was, before that, we kind of had, you know, well, everybody should have a fridge, but if you had irregular power, bang, your fridge is burned out, or if you didn't have access to the mains. There were literally clinics that had fridges sitting there that had no electricity. You're like, what is going on here? So we had built that, so we had a head start. What was crazy is all of a sudden, you know, the idea was, let's take mRNA vaccines to developing countries. That's minus 80 degrees. And we had experience because we did that in DRC for Ebola. So we knew we could do it in very difficult war situations, but not at scale. And so we scrambled and had all kinds of problems. And, you know, so that was an innovation that occurred. But again, is this a security issue? Is this for us, it's a cost issue. If we have inadequate fridges, you waste vaccines, and, you know, that's not good. So it's, again, trying to align, get the stories, have people see this as something of value.
In our remaining 2 minutes left, and I apologize if there were folks who wanted to ask a question, but I know WEF likes to keep things on time. I'm going to go to the opposite end of the scale, which is the invention piece. And I'd love each of the panelists to just, you know, maybe share one insight on how we can stoke more invention. And, you know, that's the part that precedes the innovation. But how do we get more invention, and maybe in particular invention to help, you know, the underserved populations of the world? We'll start with Danelle.
Ah, jeez.
Hashtag Bitcoin.
I don't know about Bitcoin. There's like a cryptocurrency church down the street here in. Okay, sorry. I think that venture capital is flawed. I am a recipient of venture capital. We've raised like $25, $30 million, which is great. Thanks for the money. I think structurally it's flawed. Only 3% of venture capital goes to women and people of color. if you believe, as I do, that like genius is evenly distributed throughout the human population, we are not funding genius level innovation in a moment of multiple overlapping crises, and that must be solved. And then people will say, oh, well, you should get money from the government. Government in the US actually looks to venture capital to take their cues. Who gets seed capital from Silicon Valley? Then you get a big contract from the state or federal government. And so that just needs to be fixed so that we can unlock a broader range of talent to drive innovation globally.
And Julie?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I go back to working together, public-private. I think really we're one interconnected, interdependent global supply chain. So being able to work as a team, I think that's going to make all the difference. It'll spark the innovation that's needed, whether it's short-term or long-term. And really to drive outcomes, I think it's embracing technology, and even being prescriptive with that. So what do I mean by that? It's like we go from descriptive to predictive. But if you can be prescriptive in data and analytics and actually make the recommendations, do this, not that. Go this route, not that. Use refrigerated, don't idle along a lane. But I think that's really where we can see progress and make a difference.
Seth?
The interesting thing is we have to value science, and we have to make sure our societies pay attention. I'm worried that that's changing because we don't believe in truth anymore and all of that. But the really cool thing we've been able to push is that sometimes the entrepreneurs, if they start working on a problem in the developing world, it gives them more degrees of freedom than it does in wealthy. And that was upside down. A lot of venture capital said, we don't like this. We did zipline. People talk about that here. But the interesting thing was, we were at a VC conference, and the VC stood up and said, if my CEO came and said I wanted to, invest in Africa to do this, I'd fire him on the spot. And the entrepreneur got up and said, well, I'm in California, and I have to deal with county and local and state and FAA and this regulation and that regulation. I went to Rwanda. There were no regulations. We iterated, and then the FAA came to us and said, why are you not doing this in the U.S.? Can we help you do this? And so, I think if we can change the model on its head, that's one way to get it focused on the needs of developing countries.
Great. Frank, last word.
Yeah, my point would be the normal way of thinking about invention is this is science and research and development, and that remains important. But there's other ways of invention as well. In the literature, we talk about grassroots innovation or activists, community energy, car sharing initially started out as sort of, and these ideas need to come from somewhere as well. They don't come from formalized research and development, but more from, the community level. The other is business model innovation. Again, the ideas need to come from somewhere. You need to have the technology, but then to roll it out, sometimes you need changes in your business model. And again, the idea needs to come from somewhere. This is not formalized R&D. So there's a broader set of inventions than just, the science and technology. Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been a terrific panel. I want to thank all of our panelists, Julie, Janelle, Frank, and Seth, and thank all of you.
Thank you.
It actually was a good panel.
It was, because we're all so...